Hi, Katie. Welcome to Lead Time Chats. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jean. It's lovely to be here.
Today the topic we're going to be talking about is really around mental health and supporting a team and yourself during, a year into the pandemic. And it's been a pretty brutal time, honestly. And it does feel hopeful, like we're a few months out from, widespread vaccines, hopefully. But in terms of like supporting teams and managers with regards to mental health, do you have any tips for like
Mhm.
making it through this final stretch, or what I hope to be the
Yeah,
final stretch?
yeah, absolutely. And I do just think that this final stretch has been particularly tough. There's something around coming up to, for many people, a 1 year anniversary of lockdown. And it's just the weather's the same. You put on your hand sanitizer. It's like my life has been
Yeah.
pause. It's a very strange experience. And I think a lot of us are experiencing that kind of resurgence of like grief that we had in the early stages of the pandemic when we realized we were losing so much of what makes life
Yeah.
meaningful for
And
us.
then
I think that's
Facebook is like
something.
reminding us of that too. I'm like, no,
Yes.
thank you, Facebook.
Yes.
Like,
Yes, Facebook and
please.
your iPhone gallery memories, and you're like, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that's very difficult. I think the grief is very difficult. And then the other interesting thing, which I've experienced myself and I've heard from a couple other people, is almost, now I don't know if this is the right way to phrase it, but almost like a bit of a Stockholm syndrome with the pandemic, where there's an anxiety or a fear around the pandemic ending and what that means
Mm,
for whether it's going back into an office, going back to a faster
yeah.
pace of life, going back to travel, like 2019, I spent about a third of the year jet lagged. And there's a part of me that has a real anxiety around having to make choices now, where I had a year where so many choices were removed. And for
Mhm.
some people, a lack of choice is really challenging, whereas I found it quite soothing in a lot of ways. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting how different people are being affected in these different ways. And one of the things that I always quite enjoy with any kind of messy human emotions, mental health conversations, is the BICEPS framework. So that's Paloma Medina. We can put it in the show notes, has this
Yeah.
wonderful framework of like the core human needs that we have. And what I would really recommend for managers to do for yourselves first is
Mm,
go through and figure out like of those core needs, and there's belonging, improvement or progress,
mhm.
choice, equality and fairness, predictability, and then significance or status. So, of those
Mm.
needs, which is the one that right now is feeling out of whack for you? Is it a sense of improvement or progress? In that case, what can you do about that? Can you sign up to run a half marathon and
Mm.
make some improvement there? Is it a sense of predictability? One of Lara Hogan's newsletters about 2 months ago now was, I'm going to plan out in detail my every day for the rest of
Mhm.
December. And then I saw, it reminded me of a tweet I saw 2 days ago from Danielle Morel, who is
Mhm.
the founder of Mattermark and now works at
Oh,
GitLab.
yeah.
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 And she was like, how many people plan out their day in detail? Like how far ahead? And I was like, what? Like I
Mine was like
never
zero
plan.
to one. I was
I
like,
know.
today?
It's like
Like,
I plan tomorrow if I'm being really good.
yeah.
Exactly. But she's
Interesting.
planning
Okay.
out her days into July. So I mean, something that tells me about her is
Oh,
she
okay.
cares a lot about predictability. That's something that she's
Mhm.
optimizing for. And I think it's very powerful to know, what do you need? Do you need to plan each day until July?
Mhm.
If you need that, do it. Give yourself that gift.
Right.
Um, if you need a sense of predictability, that'll help. If you're needing a sense of, I don't know, fairness, or equality, well, what's a way that you can give yourself that?
Mhm. And I like
So
that because it's not all, it doesn't all have to come from your work or from your home, right? You can kind of,
exactly.
it's not specific. And so if you're like, I need predictability, I'm not getting that through work, maybe I can, like, I mean, one thing I do is I go to the grocery store every Wednesday, and it's like something I didn't do before, but like it's been a nice predictable routine this past year, but it
That's
has nothing to do
exactly
with
it.
my
It can
work.
be, it has nothing to do with work. Exactly. And that's the thing where we're being so affected by something that isn't work. It's a pandemic. We're all in
Yeah.
this. Um, but what can we do in various areas of our lives to help us cope in the final stretch. And I think the final stretch of anything is difficult, you know, whether that's the final stretch of a long illness when you're recovering, the pandemic, if you've ever done I've never done a marathon. So in case you not think I'm a runner because of 2 marathon marathons, I'm not. But, you know, they say, you know, the last couple of miles are the hardest. And I think there's also something about, you know, once you get into that hopeful state of anticipation, there's vaccines rolling out. Hope can be a difficult emotion. You know, it can be difficult to sit with a sense of anticipation, a sense of hope. You know, I watched a Star Trek episode where somebody had been trapped on a planet for 7 years. And the quote was, well, hope is the enemy. Once you give up all hope and just embrace your situation, it's easier to deal with. It's a very stoic philosophy idea. And for a lot of us, that might have been how we've been getting through the pandemic. Like, this is the new normal. Let's just get through this. And now that the end is in sight, every additional day can feel really intolerable, can feel a lot more difficult. So
right, especially as, I mean, here the weather's getting nicer. It feels like, oh, we might have a normal summer, and so you kind of let yourself hope and think about what might be in a few months. And yeah, I've personally found that I've just been like, okay, whatever I need to do to get through the last few months, but because I framed it as the last few months, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go get that pastry box and I'm going to just like have chocolate babka for breakfast because, you know, we're so close, but then obviously those are not healthy choices that I'm making. And so I don't physically feel good. And then it's creating this like harmful loop that now I'm like, okay, I probably should exercise and not, you know, just gorge on pastry.
I mean, Jean, I had a donut for breakfast, so just so you feel better.
I don't think I even ate breakfast. It just made it even worse.
Yeah.
So
that's funny. But exactly, that's like, you know, it's the last little stretch, but you know, you need to make sure it's sustainable for yourself. Like, what are the self-care routines that you've developed as an individual over time? Now is the time to like really have those strong. If you have a meditation practice, you know, keep it going now. You know, exercise is something that there's a lot of research. It's very helpful. And I know that, you know, a lot of you also probably thinking, how do we help our teams? I was just thinking around, you know, another quarter of OKR planning and quarterly planning and, you know, reviews and all that coming up, and just how draining it is to do this remotely, even for a team that's always been remote. We're used to doing a lot of things remotely, but we've never gone so long without being together in person. Usually we have about 6 months. We're in person every 6 months maximum. And then kind of like once a quarter, you're trying to do a more strategic thing and it's all over Zoom, but it's not that often, you know, you have that opportunity for alignment. So it is difficult. I just want people to know that if this is hard for you, you're not the only one. But some of the things you can do there to make it a little bit easier. There's been this growing popularity of audio only calls. And that's something that I think there's a balance between seeing faces and wanting that human contact, and then the sort of like screen fatigue and Zoom fatigue. So I wouldn't say, you know, just transition all your Zooms to audio only and then you never see any faces. I think that can be challenging. But it is something where you're a lot less like tethered to looking at a screen. It's very tiring and intense to stare at somebody's face and close up. And
especially one-on-one, right? Like if it's a team meeting where you can kind of look around and don't have to feel so like on and presentable, it's a bit relieving.
Exactly. Whereas one-on-ones, and for managers, you're, you know, presumably doing quite a few one-on-ones. That's something that you absolutely can suggest going audio only and allowing somebody, like, they can lie down if they'd like to. Like, I've never actually done this, but why not? You know, like I can lie on the couch and talk to you one-to-one, you know, like maybe you make notes every now and then, but like you don't have to be kind of like in your laptop. You could go for a walking meeting if that's something that you're able to do. That's an option.
I've done most of my one-on-ones are on the phone, and so I'll go for a walk if it's nice out, and it's just been I mean, it's been really, really nice to, unless we have to screen share or something, we usually will just check in right before and default to phone. That's definitely been a relief. But I can totally see, like, on a Zoom meeting, you know, it is weird to see like half the squares like if you're like talking to a room and like all the squares have no faces, it's a
It's
bit like,
tricky.
yeah. So
Yeah.
finding the right balance and
Yeah.
what meetings are good for that.
Yeah. And different companies have different cultural norms around that. Like at Buffer, it's very, very unusual to turn off video.
Yeah.
Whereas there are other companies where that's sort of the default. And
Hmm.
that might be that we're very used to remote working. So
Yeah.
everybody is quite comfortable having their background in the camera. Other people,
Mhm.
it might be different. Your company is not used to working from home. People don't necessarily want their personal life kind of revealed in the
Right.
background of the video call. There's all these dynamics. But
Yeah, we default
you
to
probably know about
video.
those. Yeah.
Yeah, we default to video on, and actually mics on too, because you kind of get that like,
Yeah.
or the laughter or just those reactions,
Yeah.
whereas like it's hard to unmute just to laugh, right? Like that's kind of a weird like a weird thing to train yourself to
It
do.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
think one of the funny things that's happened is people have started like turning their camera off if they're like, oh, I'm sorry I didn't get to eat lunch, I'm just going to turn my camera off and eat. I'm like, I'm just going to eat in front of you because
I think that that's an important thing to normalize. Like,
yeah.
if you're going to be in a lot of video calls, like you're going to
Mhm.
need to get a snack, you're going to need to eat
Right,
something.
like if we were in a room together, you'd watch me eat, like, and here we
Yeah,
are.
you would be having some lunch, and that's kind of
Yeah.
normal. Yeah. So
So
exactly.
I think the biceps framework is super useful both for assessing what you need, and then having a conversation with other people, because as you
Yeah.
said, like someone may need way more predictability than you yourself need. So as a manager, that can
Yes.
help you determine like how best to support people. um I think one thing that is challenging is like, how do you, I mean, especially as a manager, you're there to support your team, but how do you do that? Or do you have any other tips for like how to do that if you yourself are struggling?
Yeah. That is a really good point. And it's difficult as a manager to be always on and be in a leadership position. I think that takes us specifically a very heavy toll. The first thing I would say is really get a therapist.
Mhm.
Like if you can at all figure out a way to do that, I really recommend it. Not just because if you might necessarily be super struggling, we all have things to work through.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
it's really important for somebody whose job is emotional labor that you
Mhm.
do in fact have support that's appropriate. You want to avoid two extremes. The first is where you kind of come across as like very robotic. You're just not going to go into any emotions. You're going to keep everything
Mhm.
very like, here's the status update. That can be a little bit hard to relate to. I imagine if you're listening to this podcast, that's probably not your style.
Mhm.
But you also want to avoid the other extreme where you as a manager are struggling, your direct reports are picking up on that, and so they are
Mhm.
providing emotional labor to you. It is
Right.
not their job to support you, it is your job to support them. But that means you need to be getting that support somewhere else. You can't just deny that you're a human being and you might have struggles. So I do think that's quite an important one. The other one would be, do you have peer support that you can lean on? So
Mhm.
in a company, this is where your EM first team, if you have other EMs, is a really critical group to get together. And if you need somebody to mastermind with, to vent, to just hear you struggle, to complain to, that
Mhm.
group should be a group that you are having strong relationships and that you can get that emotional support from. Like that would be appropriate.
Mhm.
Um, and
What about external groups? If like say you don't
absolutely.
feel like you have that internally at a company.
Exactly. And absolutely. And this is something that I think is always true for managers, but having that kind of external peer network, whether that's in, Slack groups. I'm part of a
Mhm.
couple for engineering management. One's called the Engineering Managers Slack. There's also the
Mhm.
RANS Leadership Slack. There's various
Right.
subtopics within there. But something that I've been doing is I've found other VP engineerings, engineering leaders, specifically women, and
Mhm.
on Twitter, and I've just been DMing them and say, hey, it's the pandemic. I'm kind of lonely. Leadership is tough right now. Like, do you want to have a friendly social Zoom? Like two
Yeah.
complete strangers. And you won't believe the lovely interactions I've had. I've made friends with someone I was on a panel with. Like, you
Mhm.
just need to get over the awkwardness and kind of embrace it's super weird. We're in a pandemic. Nobody really has the level of social contact we
Right.
normally do. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not normally the kind of person who's like, I have tons of friends, like, you know, but even
Yeah.
now during a pandemic, I think that's something that you absolutely can do. And specifically, if you're finding yourself feeling very isolated or very overwhelmed or anxious, social
Mhm.
contact can really help with that kind of anxiety related to the pandemic.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I
yeah.
love that. I've also felt similarly where I'm like reaching out to people for these chats and just like reconnecting with people. I'm like, what does that mean when like all my friends are like my partner will be like, where did you meet this person? I'm like, on Twitter? Like,
Yeah, they're like,
like
they're an internet
yeah, they're
friend.
like
Yeah.
internet friends, right? Like that's how I make friends now.
Yes.
Either people who live on my block or internet friends. There's like no in
Yeah,
between.
there's no in between. You're either right here or like no idea where physically, the person is.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about so I think mental health can be a somewhat sensitive topic, and I think biceps is a way to get at that in a very thoughtful way that's not like
Mm.
invasive, right? Like, hey, how's your
Hmm.
like how are you doing with your mental health? Like it seems like you may be
Yeah.
struggling, right? Like what are some other ways that you can check in with your team or know that you're available to them without feeling like you're being invasive of their,
Yeah,
things they don't want to share.
that's a good question. And like different people are going to have different tolerances for sharing, from not at all to
Yeah.
like, hugely sharing everything. One sort of very lightweight way is the traffic light color check-in, where
Mm-hmm.
you can ask somebody, how are you, on a scale of like green, yellow, orange, red. And the explanation is completely optional. So they can say, oh, I'm feeling
Yeah.
green, or I'm feeling a little bit, orange, or I'm feeling red, a bit of a tough
Mm-hmm.
day. So that's one very lightweight way to check in. Um, Talking about the biceps framework is another way.
Mm-hmm.
If you suspect that somebody is really struggling with their mental health and something seems really off, and you're wanting to check in, not just in a how are you doing sense, but like I can tell something is not usual, like something is not right. Depending on the relationship, you can either kind of say, well, how are you, in that kind of like, not how are
Mm,
you, but like, how are
really,
you,
right.
really listen and like lean in. That's one way. There's also the option of saying like, hey, I noticed that you seemed a little bit off
Mm-hmm.
lately with these things. And that's a very work appropriate way if you are noticing actual signals. I
Mm-hmm.
noticed that you were very quiet in the meeting, or I noticed that you seem a little bit more, behind on a couple notifications and things than you usually are. And it's not a problem. I'm not, unless it is, but if it's just something you're noticing, I'm just wondering what's going on for you right
What's
now.
going on?
Like if you
Yeah.
wanted to talk about that, that would still be very much within the sort of like
Mhm.
manager purview. That's a normal part of the job to check in with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like
Yeah.
the we definitely do the stoplight check-ins. We do that for people check in on range. And so you can see it.
Oh,
It
nice.
follows you like throughout the day in your meetings and stuff, which is
Oh,
really
I
nice
love
because then
that.
people can see like, oh, this person's red, like, they didn't sleep. Maybe they said they didn't sleep well, or maybe I didn't ask them
Yeah.
exactly, but I know that they're struggling today. So like
Yeah.
I'm gonna kind of take that into account in my interactions with them. But that also does assume a level of comfort and safety on the team, right? Like I'm on this
It does.
moms in tech Facebook group, and someone shared this like, sharing on a mood elevator where you are, and some of the responses were like, yeah, there's no way I would tell anyone at work like how fragile my mental state is right now. Like they don't feel safe sharing that at work. And so
Yeah.
but I think that is true, and you can still give people the opportunity to, right? If you see someone who's always green and then suddenly they're yellow, like that may be a
Mm-hmm.
red for you if you feel like, oh,
Yes.
I kind of use the full range, right?
Most people don't actually use the full range in what I'm
Yeah.
noticing. Like at Buffer, we have, we have theoretically, there's green, there's yellow, there's red. But what we
Mhm.
see is a lot of green, and then we see a lot of yellow
A
greens,
little
or people
dips
will be
into
like
yellow. Yeah.
light green or lime green.
Yeah.
And I mean, just, in your mind, just be like, cool, yellow. If someone says yellow, make it orange, just downgrade them by one. It's like how if doctors
Right.
ask people like, and how much do you drink? And the person, they add like 5 units on, like always.
Right. Yeah. Like
Um,
yellow trending
yeah.
green means like, they're kind of closer to
Orange trending
green.
yellow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But like yellow solid is like more closer to red, maybe for that
Yeah,
calibration.
maybe
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, some people, their way of coping is just, I'm not going to reveal my fragility. I am going to like
Yeah.
power through. And you know, like if somebody chooses to cope in that way, that's okay. Your job as a manager here is to hold space for those that need it and to offer
Yeah.
support where it's helpful. If somebody doesn't want that support, you can't make them. You can't, you know, force a conversation. The exception would be if you're really seeing it come through in their work, if it's whether it's
Yeah.
their interactions with colleagues or it's the actual, you know, work output. If it's and of course output and productivity is a separate conversation, but I'm sure we're all now readjusted to what's realistic. That's where you can have the conversation, but some people just aren't going to feel safe to share that.
Yeah.
There's a lot on how to build psychological safety on a team, so you can just Google psychological safety. um, Also, if you're listening to this podcast, you could always say you listen to this podcast and like anyone want to discuss it. Like that's something that would be a very, you know, light lift sort of thing. This
Yeah.
is podcast is interesting. Mental health in the
Yeah.
pandemic. Like,
Refer to
how's
this other
everyone
thing. Be like,
doing? Like,
what it, yeah,
yeah,
like
no particular
checking in.
reason. Like,
Okay.
not about you at all. I just heard the podcast, you know. Like my sister sent me a podcast on perfectionism, and I was like, "That's very interesting. I don't know why you sent it to me." Turns out I'm a perfectionist. I'm still struggling with this with this knowledge.
She just listened to a podcast and
Listened to a random
wanted to
podcast.
share.
I never thought
Wanted to
of you.
share.
You know. Yeah.
Well, cool. Thank you,
Yeah.
Katie. I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of like concrete tips and ways to start conversations if people don't feel comfortable doing that. And then also the biceps framework, which I'm definitely going to go take a look at for myself as well.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. Yeah, and thank you so much. And if you did listen to the show and you do want to connect with an internet friend, I am at Go Katie Wilde on Twitter, and I'm very, very happy to do that. I really do enjoy making friends on the internet.
Cool. Thanks, Katie.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Jean.